Hi, and welcome back to another live stream on the DD Geopolitics podcast. I am your host, Sarah, and we are joined once again by co-host John, and really happy to have Professor Marandi, frequent flyer to the show, professor at University of Tehran. But today he is coming to us all the way from Caracas, Venezuela, on the presidential elections. Professor, how are you today?
Thank you. I'm very good.
Great. So I kind of want to get a feel, because it's sort of discombobulated outside of Venezuela from what we're seeing, but inside of Venezuela, what is the general overall vibe like? Like, what was it like when you arrived, kind of leading up to the election? And what is it like now? Now that they've officially announced just about a few minutes ago or hours ago that he is officially the president, what is the energy like?
The Venezuelans invited many hundreds of international observers. Many of them are experts, and they come from bureaucracies in different countries that deal with elections. And others are people like myself who are into politics and that sort of thing. So we spent 2 or 3 days being educated about how the system is like, what the voting stations do. So we visited different voting stations before the election, and then on election day we visited a number of sites where voting was taking place to see whether it was transparent, whether things were moving forward in a smooth way or not. And from what I've seen and from what others in the different groups that were traveling across Caracas and across the country, no one saw any irregularities. Things were quiet, but they were predicting that there would be unrest, because from well before the election, the Western media and the Western-backed opposition was saying that there is going to be fraud. And they also said that we won, I don't know, 70 or 80% of the vote from at the very start as the election was taking place. So it was clear that there was going to be trouble after the election. It was not unexpected. So when this morning and this afternoon in different parts of the country, there were people who gathered and protested, no one was surprised.
Well, thank you, Dr. Marandi. And it's great to have you on and speak with you. It's really an honor. I wanted to ask you a little bit about a little more about the situation on the ground. We know that the United Socialist Party of Venezuela has maintained power in Venezuela since 2007. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to what you witnessed on the ground about the grassroots popularity of the PSUV, which is often hidden by the mainstream media in the West. But can you kind of tell us a little bit about how people were responding to the news of the election result and Maduro securing the 51% of the vote?
Well, I am not Venezuelan, and I am not all that familiar with the country. I've been here before a couple of times, but I know a bit about what's going on. There are better people who can speak in greater detail. But my understanding is that there are somewhat strong similarities between what goes on in Venezuela and what happens in Iran. In 2009, during the presidential election in Iran, we had similar accusations of fraud, and the opposition or the opposition to the government back then was saying before the counting began that we have clear evidence that we've won by a huge margin. And the Western media was backing them up, both the English media but also the very extensive Persian media apparatus. Back then, it wasn't as extensive as it is now, but it existed. The BBC, in particular, at that time was very active. So it does remind me of that. Here it is class-based to a degree. In Iran in 2009, it was also class-based. The upper class and upper middle class was, especially in Tehran, was anti-Ahmadinejad back then. And of course, that was before he changed his politics, but that's a different story. And the lower classes, the lower middle classes, the working class, those who are disenfranchised, were more supportive of Ahmadinejad. So, for example, in the city of Tehran, the north of the city, which is the more wealthy areas, they were anti-Ahmadinejad, pro-opposition to Ahmadinejad. And in the south of Tehran, the more deprived areas and the surrounding areas around the city, they were more pro the incumbent. And outside of Tehran, the majority for the administration was even greater. But the point was that people who voted against Mr. Ahmadinejad, especially in the northern part of Tehran, because many other people were voting like them, they were voting against them. When the media was telling them that there was fraud, it was believable to them, because at the voting booth at the voting station or the polling station, they saw people voting like themselves for the most part. And so that's why in the northern half of Tehran, we had large riots, but in the southern half of Tehran, we didn't, because people in the southern half of Tehran had voted for the government. And for them, it didn't make sense, the accusations of fraud, because they looked around themselves and saw that people were voting for the president back then. So it depends here too where you go. In certain parts of Caracas, which are more wealthy, and this is I'm overgeneralizing, and I don't want to push this too far because Venezuelans could give a much more nuanced answer. But in neighborhoods which are more wealthy, the opposition to the current government, to President Maduro, is stronger. And among the less, let's say, wealthy neighborhoods, or the neighborhoods which are more disenfranchised, his support is stronger. But that's a relative thing. So today we've seen in different parts of the country pockets of people protesting, but also last night the celebrations in Caracas were enormous. So I think there are certain patterns that are similar here to what we saw in 2009 in Tehran. The very fact that from well before the election, the West was saying he's going to lose, and that there's a strong chance of fraud. And by the way, social media has been used actively, as we've seen. Twitter, Musk has been very active on Twitter, and I'm sure the apparatus was working in favor of the opposition. That actually was also the case in 2009 in Iran, even though back then social media wasn't that important as it is today, but you do see these parallels. So social media amplifies certain voices, it suppresses other voices based on US interests, and here again it was more class-based, but not totally so. But I think it's fair to say that the government will be able to calm things down. The protests will gradually die down. The opponents of Venezuela and in the Americas will be active to try to marginalize the country. There will be a period where tensions will be high, but I think ultimately they will have to accept Venezuela as it is, especially since the United States has a lot of trouble as it is in Ukraine, with the genocide in Gaza, with China, and with internal problems that they have themselves. I don't think the Americans have the energy or the focus to do a great deal with against Venezuela, but that remains to be seen.
And I love that you brought up the patterns, the pattern of behavior that we see from countries, particularly in the West, trying to destabilize or push their interests in countries like Venezuela. And I wanted to ask you a little bit more because we saw recent elections in Iran as well. However, this time, notably, the Western media didn't really push back against the election result, where you saw the reformist candidate who had spoken a little bit more about developing ties to the West. Um, so I would love for you to maybe talk a little bit about how the reactions in the media between the outcome of the election in Venezuela versus the recent elections in Iran, and maybe a little bit more about how the media cartels operate to create certain narratives.
In the case of Iran, I think the West is a bit confused because they have this image of a reformist camp that is pro-Western and a principalist camp or conservative camp that is critical or hostile towards governments. But Iranian politics is much more complicated and much more nuanced. The reformist camp is very broad. It's not a monolith there. The previous president, Khatami, who was a reformist, he was actually in the 1980s and early 1990s what the West would call a hardliner. He was perhaps he and his people were among the toughest anti-Western people that you could imagine. We don't have those sort of people today in Iran, being that harsh and that critical of the West in the way they were. And they, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and also with the crushing of Saddam Hussein in Kuwait due to Saddam Hussein's utter stupidity and also corruption and foolishness. Back then, across the world, we had this rising belief that we'd reached the end of history. And you recall Fukuyama, his book on the end of history, that had an impact on Iran. And so people like Khatami, who were very tough anti-imperialists, they flipped, many of them, and they became liberal. And so back then they were called the left, or the third line in Persian. It's a khatt se, or the third line, the left. But they flipped and they became the reformists. But the reformist camp is a very broad camp. Not everyone flipped. Many of the key players flipped, but many within the reformist camp continue to be non-liberal and very critical of the West. President Pezeshkian, he is of that persuasion. He is not liberal, he is critical of the West, but he is in the broader, he would be defined in the broader reformist camp. But he also calls himself a principalist. So I would say he's in the middle. He's sort of both reformist and principalist, somewhere in the middle. And that actually makes him closer to President Raisi in many respects, because in my opinion, President Raisi was sort of in the middle of Iranian politics as well, because among the so-called principalists, or the conservatives, as they say in the West, you have very differing views. And President Raisi, in my opinion, he was somewhat in the center of Iranian politics. Of course, when we talk about center, left, and right, it's something different. These are Iranian politics, so it's not, you can't define them like you do in the West. For example, in Iran, President Raisi and President Pezeshkian are, in many ways, they're both social justice activists, social justice warriors, let's say. They advocate social justice, so they appeal to the disenfranchised. Whereas someone like Mr. Khatami, the former president, he advocated social justice, but then when he flipped to liberalism, he became more free market and that sort of thing. So President Pezeshkian like President Raisi, believes strongly in social justice, expanding social welfare, and but politically, when it comes to foreign policy, again, like President Raisi, what he has said so far is that we want to expand ties with the global South, with countries that supported us during the sanctions, neighboring countries, uh, to work to develop BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Both President Pezeshkian and President Raisi were speaking of this, and both of them spoke about negotiating with the West to see if we can find a solution to our problems, but both expressed skepticism. So President Raisi, we had the nuclear talks a couple of years ago in Vienna, which we almost had a deal when suddenly the Americans backed away. And President Pezeshkian is also saying that we can talk, but he also said that if the West doesn't change, we have options. So in many ways, I see striking similarities between President Pezeshkian and President Raisi, even though one would be considered in the broader sense reformist and the other would be considered principlist. But since they are sort of closer to the middle, I see them being more similar. In fact, in the second round of the election, the current president Pezeshkian, his rival was from the so-called principlist camp. He was in many ways very different from President Raisi, because Dr. Jalili, he did not he did not approve of President Raisi's foreign policy, especially with regards to the nuclear negotiations. He was against the nuclear negotiations, or at least the way in which it was being carried out. So it's not as if Dr. Jalili represented the late President Raisi. He had his own politics. And so I know it sounds a bit confusing to those who don't know Iranian names. What I'm just trying to say is that the president who passed away a couple of months ago, Dr. Raisi, and the current president, they have striking similarities in the policies that they've declared so far.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting, and I think it's enlightening for our audience too, because I know that some were under the impression that this was kind of a shift more toward the West. But I think how you explained it gives it a lot of good and important context. This more or less is kind of a continuation of the policy of President Raisi. Of course, you have the Ayatollah at the head of the government, and so there's continuity there. But also from the United States perspective, it does make sense to go to lean towards these candidates that might have more reformist tendencies and try to exploit them. So in my mind, it makes a lot of sense as to why the United States wasn't calling foul when it came to the outcome of the Iranian election. But kind of shifting the topics a little bit, I'm curious about how election interference actually happens and how the West conducts election interference on behalf of interests or against interests that it wants to counter. And specifically, not necessarily how election interference happens at the polls, but how the West uses non-governmental organizations to operate within a country to shift the narrative and kind of lay the groundwork for color revolution and undermining the democratic process of countries. So I would love if you could maybe speak a little bit about how this kind of happens concretely, how the West uses NGOs to shift public opinion and undermine democracy.
Well, there are many different things that they do at different levels, and it depends on the circumstances, because it's not just during election period. It's during the whole year when there is no election. They always have objectives and plans, and so what I would say is that in general, they have a huge media apparatus when it comes to Iran. Here I'm sort of tilting away from Venezuela. They have literally hundreds of media outlets. There are more Persian language media outlets in the West that are funded to undermine Iran than there are media outlets inside the country. And they have huge cyber armies, the biggest being in Albania, where there are
MEK.
literally thousands of people there working day and night online, each of them tens of accounts, if not more. They run tens of accounts and they're constantly active online. And of course, social media platforms promote uh, these accounts, and they, as I said earlier, they try to weaken the voice of accounts like myself. I mean, like people like myself. My it's been a long time, but my Facebook account has been deactivated. My Instagram account was deactivated, and right now the only account that I have is a Twitter account. And there are many others like me, not just in Iran, but in Iraq and Lebanon and Syria and Yemen and elsewhere. Many people who have lost their accounts, and then other people are afraid to use their accounts or to be too active because some of my own students tell me that we're afraid that if we like something, then if tomorrow we want to get a study abroad, we may not be able to do so. So it creates a strong element of censorship as well, and shadow banning and all that. We have that too. So social media is used as a tool, and constantly. And another thing is that in the case of Iran, just as in with the Soviet Union or other ideologies, they target the ideology. So since Iran is a Muslim country, it's religious for the most part. Doesn't mean people are like everyone is religious and they pray, but if you ask 90% of Iranians, do they consider themselves as religious? They say yes, but it means being religious is a different thing to different people. Someone may not even pray, but she will still may say that I'm religious, or someone may not wear the hijab, or they'll still consider themselves to be religious. So what they often do is that these Persian media outlets abroad, they target religion. They're very hostile towards religion. Even during key religious uh, days, like during the Ashura ceremony or during Ramadan, they become particularly hostile to religion. So they try to weaken the ideology so that people become apolitical. And that's one means. And that's something that they also did during the Cold War, for example, with regards to the Soviet Union. They promoted, for example, in the arts, they promoted, there's a very good book, it's called Who Paid the Piper? That's the British title. I forgot what the name of the American title was. It's something like the CIA and cultural wars or something like that. But in that book, it documents how the United States used culture to make people in the Eastern Bloc apolitical, to make elites apolitical. So the first step is to take their ideology away from them, and then they go on to the next stage. So, for example, the Persian media that's broadcast from the West is is very hostile to religion, but also it's also very racist. So, uh, for example, it's very anti-Arab. The Persian media based in London is very hateful of, across the West, it's hateful. It hates Islam, it hates religion, and it hates the Arabs. It's constantly saying how evil, how terrible the Arabs are. The Arabs are your enemies. The Palestinians hate uh, Iranians. They hate the Shia. They're constantly trying to uh, create a divide between Iranians and religion, Iranians and Arabs, and uh, and so uh, and then of course there's the usual, you know, rumor mongering, or let's say if there's some corruption in Iran, they exaggerate, or if there's some problem in Iran, they exaggerate its significance and also they are constantly telling Iranians that you're miserable people. So many, and it has an impact, even though many Iranians don't take these media outlets seriously. But when it's constantly being beamed in from all sorts of television stations or online platforms or Telegram channels or in Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and so on, it does have an impact. So many people in Iran do seem to think that Iran um, is terribly poor, whereas compared to most countries in the world, even though life is difficult under sanctions, life in Iran is better than in many places. Just as an example, gasoline in Iran is like 2 or 3 cents a liter, whereas you know how much it costs in Europe and the United States and almost everywhere else. It's the same is true with electricity; it's heavily subsidized, and another natural gas is heavily subsidized in Iran as well. So, for example, during the last couple of months, I paid nothing for electricity because they said you saved energy. And, so I think it was like a month or 2 months, I don't recall. I didn't pay anything for my bill because they said you conserve. And a lot of people, they face that sort of thing. We do pay bills, and for some people, they are still expensive. But what I'm saying is that compared to outside of Iran, it's very cheap. So while wages in Iran are relatively low, many of the costs in Iran are also very low. But people are told that they're very impoverished, that this is, you live in a horrible country, it's the worst in the world. And so that sort of, they're constantly waging psychological warfare against Iranians. So they're saying that your so-called Arab friends are really your enemies. Your religion is, they try to undermine religion because they see that as Iran's strong line of defense, especially uh, things like Karbala and Ashura, and which has a huge impact on Iranian resilience and the resilience of people in this region. So they try to undermine these events. Then, of course, we have the sanctions, which is true in Venezuela as well. They put their boots on the throats of the people, and then they tell them that, look, your government is incompetent. So they try to make people suffer as much as possible. They prevent, for example, Iran from using the international banking system, and that makes it very difficult to import medicine, medical supplies to produce medicine in the country. It makes it difficult for factories to function properly, so people lose their jobs. It makes imported supplies or goods more expensive, so it drives up inflation. Therefore, it makes life more difficult. It makes sometimes certain medicines are inaccessible. Sometimes people lose their jobs. So and people die. And so they try to make people suffer as much as possible. So sanctions combined with psychological warfare, which is multidimensional, in addition to the fact that they try to shut down our accounts, or they try to create self-censorship among ordinary Iranians so they don't lose their accounts. All that combined is something that we see throughout the year, day and night. But during elections, it manifests itself in a particular way. During riots, for example, what we did see a couple of years ago was that, for example, when Ms. Mahsa Amini passed away, immediately these Persian media outlets were saying that they beat her up, they tortured her, and she died under torture. And 3 days later, the footage came out showing that she was not. There was no sign of her being beaten. The autopsy showed that she had no injuries. It came out that she had operation on her brain when she was, I think, 9. But it was too late. They'd already, uh, convinced a portion of, especially young people, 16 to 20, that she was beaten to death and all that. And so we had the riots, and then, but also Western intelligence agencies, they cultivate people through Telegram channels, through WhatsApp, through other means, and they pay them through Bitcoin. They create groups inside the country to carry out not just Western intelligence agencies, but also groups that are affiliated to intelligence agencies, like Iranian groups abroad, terror groups or other groups, and they pay people through Bitcoin to carry out attacks on buildings, on automobiles, to burn cars, and that sort, and to attack policemen. And one interesting thing was that during the riots that we had a couple of years ago, the Persian media based in London was inviting people, guests, who were saying, yes, killing the police. One lady said that it's a holy thing to do, to kill police officers. And they killed 70 or 80 police officers in Iran. But the Western media was, saying that the police in Iran were killing people. But the number of police officers that were killed during that period were huge. And by the way, the same was true in Venezuela during the unrest a few years ago. Large number of police officers were killed through very violent riots in this city, in Caracas. So you see the same sort of themes. You see very strong parallels in. They're not identical, but as I said, when you look at the violence towards police in Iran, uh, and the violence that existed towards police, I don't know if I don't know if anything like this has happened today. I haven't heard of police being attacked or anything like that, but I'm talking about the unrest that we had a few years ago in Venezuela. Disproportionately a large number of police officers were targeted and killed. So it's very complicated. They use sanctions. They use um, their allies, countries, Western countries, and their client regimes to put pressure on governments. They did that towards Iran, and they do the same. They've been always doing the same towards Venezuela. So, as I said, there are striking similarities. I think there are differences too, but it'll take too much of the time of your audience to go any further. I think that's I guess enough for now.
That was very, very helpful, and very insightful.
And by the way, I should
Yep.
add that the Arabic media in the region, which is controlled by oil-rich dictatorships in the Persian Gulf and other dictatorships, mostly client regimes, they do the same thing, but towards Iranians. They're hostile towards Shia. They fabricate stories about Shia or about they're very hostile towards Persians, very racist. Often they make claims about Shia ideology that are completely untrue and unfounded and fabricated, and they try to create hatred towards Iranians and towards the Shia. And then in the Persian language, and these are controlled, as I said, mostly by these Arab dictatorships, many of them oil-rich. And then the Persian media, which is controlled by the West, by Israel, and some of these Arab dictatorships, although the Arab dictatorships have sort of, I think, backed off of this particular industry for now, because they want some sort of rapprochement with Iran. The Persian media based in the West, they are hostile towards Arabs. So it's very interesting that the West and its allies, they tell the Iranians that the Arabs are your enemies, and then they tell the Arabs that the Iranians are your enemies, and that sort of thing. So that's how it works basically.
Well, I wanted to ask you about, not to go too much in depth into U.S. politics, but of course, the conservatives and Republicans are always seen as very strident against Iran. But you also have a very important aspect of U.S. politics, which is the liberal voices that are used often, in my view, to create consent for intervention ultimately. And actually, recently we had one of our kind of prominent liberal politicians, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, again harp on this idea of the quote morality police in Iran and the limitation of freedoms for women specifically. And so I wonder if you had any thoughts or reflections about how this liberal segment of US politics is used to create consent for intervention and propagate a lot of these false narratives that we hear about Iran.
Well, again, the Western media, whether it's CNN or the BBC or Fox News or anything else, their depiction of Iran is always a caricature. Again, very similar to what we have in Venezuela, from what I've been seeing on the BBC and the CNN and other media outlets. It's very different from what I'm seeing in Caracas. And people who travel to Iran are always very shocked that it's so different from what they've heard. And that's because Western media narratives are so irrational and hostile, and of course they use particular narratives for political purposes. In Iran, women, they dress as they like. They, people can look on YouTube or wherever. But there are certain norms in Iran which, and they're based upon an ideology. It's based upon the Islamic ideology, that women should not be commodified, objectified, sexualized, and so on. But they wear different dresses, different colors. Some are more conservative. Some are their clothing is more revealing, or it's not as if if they're women, they're all the same way. But what Iran considers to be pornography, what Iran considers decent exposure, is different from Western standards. And of course, there's a debate in Iran about what should be where where the law should stand on all this. It's not as if there's no debate in Iran. There's always debate in Iran. If you sit in a taxi in Iran, or if you go and use the metro, or if you sit in a bus, Iranians are always talking politics. They're cursing. You'll hear people cursing the government or the state or religion, or it's very normal in Iran. It's been like that ever since I was a teenager. Ever since I was politically aware, that's always before the revolution. No, people did not talk politics, but after the revolution, people do talk politics, and it's very different from the sort of picture of Iran in the West. However, the West is, regardless of what someone may think about dress, indecent exposure, or what they think that the law should be. The West is not sincere about women in Iran, or children in Iran, because first of all, the sanctions are directed against women and children. They are directly against the most vulnerable people in society. The people who are more vulnerable are the ones who are hurt the most. The working class, those who have smaller salaries, and of course, children and girls are among the most vulnerable. So they don't care about women. And then when we look at Gaza, for example, they're fine with this Holocaust. They have no problem with the daily massacre. We wake up in the morning, women and children are being massacred. We go to bed at night, they're being massacred. We wake up again tomorrow, it's the same thing. So Western media, Western politicians, Western elites, Western diplomats, none of them have any concern for Palestinian women and children. So obviously, that is all nonsense. And I think that now people, and what is interesting is that in Iran, many of my former students who were actually protesting on the streets in Iran a couple of years ago, or some of them even rioting, they now have a different view of the world than they did a couple of years ago, because they were listening to the Western media say how bad and evil Iran was, and they were young and naive, and they didn't know much about their own history. Some of them were in high school, some of them just entered university. The university students often think that they know everything undergraduates the first couple of years, and then gradually they become more mature, and that's why most of those who are like in the protests were undergraduate students rather than graduate students. But in any case, many of them over the last 9-10 months, their politics have evolved. They see the United States for what it is. They see Europe for what it is. They see that they're behind the genocide. They're supporting the genocide. They're funding the genocide. They're arming this army of genocide. So maybe some of them, or many of them, have not, turned and become hardcore supporters of the revolution, but they are no longer supportive of Western governments or Western narratives, or they no longer believe Western narratives. So things have changed a lot in Iran, I think. And I think the same is true across the global South. So right now, one thing that I have seen is that Iran has become much more popular in circles, and I've seen that here in Venezuela, with a lot of people who've been coming in from the observers who've come from across Asia and Africa and Latin America. I do see that when I speak to people, that Iran has become much more popular today because they see what the West is doing in Gaza, and they see what Iran and its allies are doing in defense of Gaza. So a lot has changed, and largely thanks, or no thanks, I don't know, to the despicable policies of Western regimes in West Asia and in Gaza and Palestine in particular.
Well, I kind of want to segue into Palestine because Palestine wasn't forgotten at all during yesterday's celebrations. I want to show a few clips here. So first,
Vas a defender Palestina, presidente. Palestina.
Viva Palestina libre.
He has spoken about it multiple times yesterday, and then I need to show this clip of our cheeky friend Marwa.
Venezuela ha provocado más de un baño de sangre. Lo viví como joven que sobreviví. Hoy entiendo, gracias a Dios, entiendo por qué sobreviví.
What can you tell us about kind of the parallels of the Venezuelan and the Palestinian struggle for liberation and independence from the West? And have you had any conversations that have talked about those parallels while you've been in Venezuela?
Yes, obviously, most Venezuelans, or all Venezuelans that I've spoken to, are pro-Palestine. They're hostile towards the Israeli regime, and from my conversations with people, overwhelmingly people here dislike the Israeli regime, and they dislike what the United States is doing. Again, I'm not an expert, and your viewers may have much more sophisticated responses to this question, and so I should be very careful. But what I would say is that a lot of people here who are not enthusiastic about the current government, it's because, not just because of the constant narratives against the government that are supported by social media, US controlled social media, and a lot of the media that's controlled by the elites and the powerful and the wealthy, but also because of fatigue. Many people just want the sanctions to end. They hope that if they just give the Americans what they want, then everything will magically go away. We also see that, we've seen that in the past in Iran, when, for example, President Rouhani was elected 11 years ago. He said that he'll solve the problems with the West, and he'll solve our issues over the nuclear program. And the Iranian negotiating team gave huge concessions, in my opinion, too many concessions to the West, to the United States in particular. And the Americans cheated Iran. The nuclear deal, the JCPOA, was a deal where the Iranians gave significant concessions. The West gave less concessions, but the West didn't even abide by their commitments, and they were not punished for not doing so. So Iran abided by its commitments. The West didn't. Iran gave more concessions. They gave less. And things in Iran didn't get where they were supposed to get. We were supposed to have, a wonderful economy, and we were supposed to be living at the top of the world. But ultimately, Obama, he kept violating the deal, making it worse as time progressed. And then Trump just simply tore up the deal and nothing happened. The Americans did not pay any price, no political price, no punishment in accordance with the deal. And so many in Iran became disillusioned with that school of thought. They became more realistic about how the West works. The West sees itself as exceptional. They can ignore their commitments because they are the West, but everyone else has to do so. Just like we saw with the political agreements over Ukraine, the Minsk Accords, they were ignored by the West. Why? Because the West, again, they consider themselves to be exceptional. They consider themselves to be the adults in the room. The rest of us are subhuman, lesser human, childlike, and so they can ignore their commitments because they are exceptional. They are superior to the rest of us, but the rest of us have to abide by our commitments. That's how they are with everyone. With everyone, they do a deal with Venezuela, they'll cheat Venezuela. They do a deal with Iran, they'll cheat Iran. They do a deal with the Russians, they'll cheat the Russians. That's how it always works. They'll do a deal with Hamas or anyone else. They always cheat. And the Western media will not say anything about it because they are part of that, of that broader ideology. They think in a similar way. They all think that they are morally superior, intellectually superior. They're superior civilization. So, for example, Elon Musk will say that Maduro is a dictator and shame on you, but Elon Musk was just clapping in Congress for Netanyahu, the Hitler of our era. And of course, it's not just Netanyahu; the whole regime is it's like the Nazi regime, if not worse. So, who is Elon Musk to talk about President Maduro? He is, the two. You cannot even compare the two. He is infinitely more evil than anything Maduro could ever be. But that's how it is in the West. They consider themselves to be at a different level of morality and humanity. So they can destroy countries. They can invade Iraq and then say, yes, it was a mistake. So if 1 million people die, it's a mistake. But if, let's say, a young lady in Iran collapses and dies, they'll say, look, it's a barbaric regime, even though there's no evidence that anyone beat her, regardless of whether the laws for indecent exposure in Iran are, people agree upon them or not. That's a different case altogether. But the point is that the standards for morality are just completely different. You can't compare a Westerner with a non-Westerner. They have different standards for themselves, and those standards are infinitely different. I don't know if I answered the question though, but the point is that many people here who don't vote for the government, or who voted against the government, or who were just sat at home and felt that it's no use, many of them are sympathetic to the Palestinian people, but they just felt that the sanctions are hurting them so much that maybe if they just voted for the opposition, or if they just give up and sit at home, things will get better, or maybe they thought that things will not get any better no matter what they do. So that again is a part of the Western strategy.
And it really is so shocking to see that image, right, of Elon Musk literally being an invited guest of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and then can have the lack of awareness just days later to tweet shame on Maduro. That to me is just, the hypocrisy is just so out in the open, and
It's
the
not
lack
a
of
lack of
awareness.
awareness. These people
Well,
know
right.
who they are. They
Intentional,
know
right,
quite well who they are. They
right.
know what they are. He when he speaks of Christianity, he is no Christian. Just like no Zionist is really a Christian. No Jewish Zionist is a Jew. Moses or Jesus would never condone what these people are doing, carrying out genocide in the name of Moses or in the name of Jesus, or like ISIS in the name of Islam. That's all. They know who they are, and they know what they're doing, and they know exactly what's going on in Gaza. They know exactly what they're clapping for, and they know exactly why they're opposing Maduro or anyone else who opposes U.S. policy. And I think it's quite clear that 50 years from now, when the world changes and history books are written, they'll be presented as examples of great evil.
And it just solidifies in my mind that Maduro and all of this is on the right side of history if you have these enemies that are targeting you. But I think that
Yes,
we wanted
without
to
a
end
doubt. I mean, I think it's clear that whether it's Maduro or the point is that I'm not Venezuelan, and I don't want to, say too much about Venezuela, because Venezuelans know much more about the country, both those who support the government and those who are against the government, or those who are just simply sitting at home. But the point is that the great evil is the empire that is constantly manipulating countries across the world, whether it's in West Asia or East Asia or South Asia or Central Asia or Central Africa or North Africa or the North America or Latin America. It doesn't matter. That empire is the great evil of our time. And we see what they're doing, for example, in Gaza, in Palestine, that empire led by the Americans. And so the Venezuela government is on the right side of history because it's a sovereign country. It has its own government, and it's none of the business of the Americans to make ordinary Venezuelans suffer and to manipulate politics in the country, just as it was the case in Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya, in Yemen, and all the other places where the Americans carried out genocide, in Vietnam and elsewhere, and where they're doing the same thing. They do the same thing across the different continents, and that's why the global South is so hostile to the United States, because whenever they see a genocide like in Gaza, they look back and say to themselves that, well, that's what happened in our land 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 30 years ago. Everyone has the same sort of experience when it comes to the West. The only difference with Gaza, what makes it more evil than previous genocides, is that they're doing it in front of us. They're doing it in front of an international audience, and they're still, trying to justify it. That's never been done before. In the past, you would see a few photos here and there, but people wouldn't be massacred day and night, children's bodies ripped apart, and then they'd move on, and then they'd pretend that they're the good guys. This is new. But what the West doesn't understand is not only are they losing many people in their own countries, I think they get that, but I don't think they understand how deeply despised they are across the global South, because the global South is seeing this, but also because the global South has everywhere across the global South, they have a history with the West that they see it being repeated in Gaza.
Well, thank you so much for spending so much time with us. I wanted to end just with a question about where you see the future for Iran headed in the next few months. Of course, we've seen another flurry of tensions and conflict on the part of the Israelis, primarily toward both the Houthis in Yemen, also along the northern border with Hezbollah. But I wanted to kind of get your sense about what you think the direction of the conflict will go over the course of the next few months, and what the future for Iran holds, maybe more generally.
It's
Maybe a bit
difficult
more.
to say. There are many analysts who've been discussing this over the past few months, and if you go back and look at the archives of different programs, this discussion has been going on for 8-9 months now, and I really am not good at predictions. I probably get it completely wrong. So, and I would imagine that we will have escalation in the coming days because of the what happened in the Golan Heights. I don't want to go into detail because I'm sure your viewers, they're usually very politically aware and they know of what the Iron Dome does and how their anti-aircraft missiles often hit the ground and kill people. It's happened in Kiev as well. The different anti-aircraft systems that America, like the Patriot missile defense system, we've seen this happen before. So regardless of what happened in the Golan Heights and who is responsible, I think it's very clear that after 9-10 months, Hezbollah has been very careful about not killing innocent civilians. There are very few Israeli civilians that have died in 10 months, whereas the Israelis are slaughtering Palestinians day and night. Just in the West Bank, which has nothing to do with Gaza, I think almost 600 people have been killed since October the 7th. I'm not sure about the number. I think it's almost 500 or almost 600. I'm not sure. Your viewers can look it up. But the point is that the Israelis they don't care about the Palestinians. They just destroyed infrastructure. They destroyed just recently their ability to use water and to pump water. They did it openly. They want to starve Palestinians. They want Palestinians to die of disease and sickness. We saw all the evidence of it in the South African complaint to the International Court of Justice. They were open about it, about how they want to starve Palestinians, and they've been genocidal in their rhetoric, from the president to the prime minister to government ministers and so on. There's no question about it. But then when a few people in the Golan Heights die, tragically, first of all, the Golan Heights does not belong to Israel. Even in accordance with Western accepted laws, it's occupied territory. It belongs to Syria. The Israelis should not be there. But regardless of who actually caused the death of these young people, the West makes this a big issue, and we all see how hypocritical they are, because every day tens and sometimes hundreds of people are being killed in Gaza, yet suddenly this becomes important for the West. Why? Because the West is trying to justify Israel. They're apologetic. They justify that they do whatever they can to help Israel. So all these mainstream Western journalists and all of the diplomats and all of the elites, they are complicit in genocide. They are part of this genocide. They are as guilty as the soldiers that are killing these children. They are child killers, just like the rest of them. But I do think there will be escalation. Netanyahu has been defeated in this war. He's been defeated in Gaza. He's been defeated in the Red Sea. The Americans have been defeated in the Red Sea, and he's been defeated alongside the Lebanese border. So either he has to continue this war, and escalation is one option. But in my opinion, escalation will only make it worse for the Israeli regime, because the Israeli regime has much more to lose than Lebanon. The Israelis can murder innocent Lebanese, and they would be very happy to do so, because that's what the Dahiya doctrine that the Israelis have means crushing ordinary people. Dahiya is a neighborhood in Beirut. They level the city to the ground. In Gaza, they call it mowing the grass, right? So in Lebanon, they call it the Dahiya doctrine. In other words, slaughter people. That's official Israeli policy. They can do that, but Hezbollah and the resistance, they can destroy Israeli infrastructure. Lebanon doesn't have much infrastructure because of the way in which the West treats Lebanon. They prevent it from really growing. They keep the country behind. It doesn't have electricity. They only have a couple of hours of electricity a day. So how much damage can the Israelis do to infrastructure when it's almost non-existent? But Israel, its infrastructure is very vulnerable. Hezbollah can, destroy the country's infrastructure. And what would that mean for the future of Israel when the war is over? That would mean people will never invest there again. I don't think they will. They will anyway. But in future, it will get only worse. And so the Israeli regime has much more to lose. But I don't think that the regime is being rational. The whole political establishment in Israel is racist and right wing in that sense, because left and right doesn't mean much anymore in the West nowadays. It's not very different from what it meant 30, 40 years ago. But it's very extremist, the whole political establishment. But the current regime, the Netanyahu regime, they're more extreme than the previous governments. So they don't think rationally. And I think that they are destroying Israel. They've destroyed Israel in the eyes of the world because they've shown themselves to be genocidal. I don't think they understand really how bad it is when in China people hate Israel. Even in India, where at the beginning the narrative and views were different than much of the rest of the global South, even now you see anti-Israeli sentiments growing very rapidly in Russia and elsewhere. So Israel is hated across the world. And so it's not just a military defeat, it's not just economic vulnerability, but their image has been destroyed. And I think that the Israeli regime is destined to fail, and escalation will only quicken the collapse. Now, when that collapse will happen, that's another issue altogether. But I don't think we're going to see the Israeli regime in its current form in 10 years' time from now.
Well, that is probably all the time that we have to take from you for today. Professor Marandi, thank you so much for joining us and your patience with getting connected to us all the way from Venezuela. We will continue to bring you guys news from Venezuela. There is a after stream space for discussion in an hour. And Professor, why don't you let everybody know when you'll be back in Iran and what is in store when you get there?
I will be traveling in a few hours from now, so we're pretty far from Iran, but I will be back home soon, hopefully.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Please visit ddgeopolitics.com. Follow us everywhere. Follow Professor Marandi on X, and we will see you soon, sometime this week. More about Venezuela for sure. Thank you so much, and have a good day.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.